Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next episode in our plant-based life cycle nutrition series. That's always a mouthful to say for some reason. But we're moving on to the next age group. And specifically today, we are talking about plant-based nutrition for ages 4 through 18, which I realize is a really big range. That's a lot of years right there. But most of the plant-based nutrition principles are consistent throughout this age. Really, the only thing that varies is as the child grows bigger and bigger, they obviously need more and more nutrition, but all of the same principles apply. So we're going to lump together all of those age ranges here. But yeah, I do just want to first say a little bit of a disclaimer that yes, I have the education, on the topic of plant-based nutrition for this age range, but I do not have the personal experience yet because my own daughter is only 9 months right now. And so I'm going to be talking about ideally what our nutrition looks like for children in this age range. But I know that the application, of applying these principles in the kitchen at the dinner table might have its challenges. I know I hear from older parents that sometimes it can be hard dealing with, picky children or, just kind of navigating all of the nuances that can come up around food in this age range. So we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. I was thinking it would be helpful in today's episode to talk about what the specific nutritional needs are and also special considerations for plant-based children. And then later on, talk about some of the strategies for how we can create a nice and peaceful, relaxed dining setting or eating setting, feeding setting for our children so that we can support, their own motivation and desire to enjoy these healthy foods at home too, right? Okay, so let's just dive right into it and talk about, what's happening in these little bodies in this age range because, I think it'd be helpful. We're going to be talking about, kind of different. It's easy to talk about kind of ages 4 to 8, then 9 to 13, and then 14 to 18. These are kind of good kind of separations in this age range where we can talk about nutritional needs. But in general, between the ages of 4 and 12, there is just so much growth going on. There's so much cognitive development going on. There can be, episodes of growth spurts followed by not much growth. And you will find that when the child is in a growth spurt, they're obviously going to have a much higher appetite versus when they're not in a growth spurt. But obviously, nutritional needs are higher in proportion to their weight. So as the kid gets bigger, they're going to need more nutrition. And on average, between the ages of 4 and 8, moderately active kid needs about 1,400 to 1,600 calories. When they hit the ages of 9 to 13, they then will need more, typically on average 16 to 2,200 calories. So, these little bodies need a lot of fuel to keep growing and also to be thriving as well. Let's just talk a little bit about macronutrients. It's generally recommended that carbohydrates make up 45 to 65% of calories, and that fat makes up 25 to 35% of calories in the diet, the rest being made up by protein. And I do just want to point out here that when we're talking about kids' nutrition, generally it is recommended that they get more fat than, our whole food plant-based adults do. I know that most of our listeners here are whole food plant-based eaters, and you're used to us talking about how this lifestyle is so great and so helpful for health and longevity and reversing disease because it's naturally low in fat. We talk about how ideally our fat intake is close to around, 10 to 15% of calories from fat. Well, for children, they really need that fat for, a good source of calories and also just the nutrition for their cognitive development for so much more. And so it is recommended that for kiddos, especially, when they're quite a bit younger and they still have a small stomach. They're not able to eat as much of these kind of low fat or, low calorie dense, high fiber foods. They simply don't have the room in their stomach. That's when these higher fat foods, avocados, nuts, seeds, nut butters, coconut, these foods can be so, so helpful. And yes, aiming for that 25 to 30% of calories coming from fat is ideal. Although, of course, if you're a nutrition geek like me, yeah, you might actually look into these macro ratios. But honestly, my recommendation for parents feeding their children would be not so much to worry about all of these numbers. This is just, for educational purposes, right? Not actually practically counting the nutrition that's going into our children each day. But let's just talk about protein a little bit. Protein needs increase. Well, so protein needs are easily met in general by all children, regardless of their diet, as long as they're eating enough, right? Generally, kids are getting plenty of protein. And it's recommended that ages 4 to 8 get at least 19 grams of protein. And then that increases to 34 grams of protein in the ages of 9 to 13. So yeah, our protein needs obviously increase as our body mass increases, but you can still see here 19 grams, 34 grams. This is very easily attainable from plant foods. We don't even need to go out of our way to source, lots of tempeh or kind of meat substitutes. Although we will talk about the benefit of having, focusing on making sure that there is some source of a higher protein food in each meal as well. So let's see, what else do I want to talk about here in this age range? Let's just go over kind of the micronutrient recommendations for this age range. And we see that calcium is still recommended to get 1,000 milligrams for 4 to 8-year-olds. And then that increases to 1,300 milligrams at age 9. And this is because there's just such rapid growth of our bones. And we need this calcium for that mineralization of that bone. And of course, bone health is not just dependent on calcium. We also need all the other minerals and vitamin D and so on and so forth. But calcium is an important mineral for our growing kiddos. And so this is why making sure that there is some kind of calcium-rich food in the diet regularly is also very helpful and recommended for plant-based kids. Because once again, them having that smaller stomach, they might not be able to eat all the leafy greens they need to get 1,000 milligrams of calcium, or, leafy greens and beans. They might need a more concentrated source of calcium. And if you listen to our last week's episode, we talked about this is why bringing in some kind of, calcium fortified soy milk or pea protein milk can be helpful, just to have some convenient source of calcium in the diet. Or maybe you just want to opt for, kind of a multivitamin that has a good source of calcium in it as well, to cover those bases. But we, definitely do want to make sure our kids are getting enough calcium. And I'll just speak from my own experience in conducting nutritional analyses for adults. I'd say most adults are not eating 1,000 milligrams of calcium from plant foods if they are eating plant-based. Hopefully they are getting at least like 700 milligrams. But oftentimes if people aren't eating enough, then they're not going to be eating enough calcium from plant foods. And with kids, if they're also working with, just a smaller stomach, not able to handle as much fiber as an adult stomach, then, just an extra reason why bringing in some very, a concentrated calcium source in their diet would be very, helpful and recommended. And so, yeah, generally what's recommended is that calcium fortified plant milk, or bringing in some, calcium set tofu, for example. These are kind of the food-based sources of calcium that are, very rich in calcium, or like I said, bringing in a multivitamin can be helpful here. Also, the other, in addition to calcium, there are 4 other nutrients that it's, very good to consider to kind of have more focus on for plant-based kids. I do want to say, apart from these next 4 nutrients that I'm going to mention, the plant-based diet really covers all of the other nutrients in a very stellar and thorough way. When we're eating when the diet is comprised of mostly whole plant foods, then yes, we cover our other, vitamin B or B vitamins, not vitamin B12. We're going to be talking about that in a bit. But vitamin A is covered, vitamin C is covered, vitamin E is covered if the kids are eating leafy greens. And then many of the other minerals are completely covered as well. Iron, as long as they're getting plenty of beans and, good dark kind of green vegetables and leafy greens. But let's talk about these 4 other nutrients that generally, we want to keep a closer eye on for plant-based kiddos and kids in general, right? Vitamin D, of course, we know that it's generally recommended now that regardless of diet, that kids are supplementing with vitamin D, just because, there's no consistency in, knowing how much vitamin D they're getting from going outside versus being inside, and summer versus winter, and skin tone, and all these other variables. So the recommended vitamin D amount for this age range, 4 to 8, and also 9 to 13, is 600 IU. So that can easily be, received through a supplement. B12, we still need to make sure that our, plant-based kids are getting B12. And yes, this goes into adulthood as well. If we're eating a plant-based diet and we don't have a dietary source of B12, we need to supplement. So the dose for 4 to 8-year-olds is 1.2 micrograms. It's really not very much at all. And then for 9 to 13, that goes up to 1.8 micrograms. The next nutrient that we need to be, just aware of is iodine, because mostly in, the kind of American diet, the biggest source of iodine is seafood or iodized salt. And if the family doesn't eat seafood or use iodized salt in their cooking, they're going to need some other kind of dietary source of iodine. And usually what that looks like for hopefully plant-based eaters is, either seaweed or a supplement. And the benefit of the supplement over seaweed is that you get a more, standard reliable dose. And then, the benefit of seaweed over the supplement is that you're getting it from a whole food source. But the downside of the seaweed as being the source of iodine is you just don't know how much you're getting. And when we're talking about our, little kiddos, their little bodies, and, them being in this crucial phase of development, my personal opinion is that it's better to have, a reliable dosage where you know exactly how much iodine is going into your child's body versus, with the seaweed, it's like there could be some days where they're getting way too much. There could be some days where they're getting none at all. And so from my opinion, getting a supplement, really, I think the best, most convenient way to go about making sure these nutrients are covered is just finding a good plant-based multivitamin for children. And you've probably heard us talk in other podcast episodes where we're talking about kind of adult health and, healing from chronic illnesses with whole food plant-based nutrition, saying that, you don't need multivitamins, they're not necessary. This is all true in the case of, adults, as long as you're eating enough, as long as you're focusing on whole plant foods and you're eating enough. We're a broken record when we're saying you need to make sure you're eating enough. But it changes a little bit when we are talking about pediatric nutrition, and just knowing that, we might have this idea of, the plate that we're going to make for our kids, and hopefully they eat this all and it's a perfectly balanced plate that I'm going to give my kid, right? It's one thing to know, like, okay, what nutrition is needed in a balanced plate for a child at this age, but it's another thing to see if they're actually going to eat that food themselves, right? So, I think a lot of parents are up against several challenges, making sure that their kids are getting enough nutrition, their kids' willingness to eat the food being one of the big ones. And that's why at this age, I'm definitely one to say that I see the value of bringing in a multivitamin, and I don't think it's going to cause the child any harm at all to bring in a multivitamin, even though, In general, yes, we generally say that the nutrition from our food is really, it is the best because it has this, synergistic effect in our body where we're able to assimilate and absorb it better and all of that groovy stuff. I usually don't use the word groovy, so I don't know why that came out, but yes, I see that in this context, a multivitamin certainly has its value, right? And the iodine recommended amount for kids 4 to 8 is 90 micrograms, and then kids 9 to 13, 120 micrograms, just for your reference. But the last nutrient that I want to talk about that it's very helpful to keep an eye on for plant-based kids and also non-plant-based kids, honestly, is DHA, and that is one of our omega-3 fatty acids. And there's just more and more research coming out showing that making sure that kids get adequate levels of DHA in their diet is so helpful for cognitive development. And so the recommended amount for ages 4 to 6 is about 150 to 200 micrograms, and then ages 6 to 10 is 200 to 250 milligrams. And then honestly, there's I couldn't find from any of the organizations, World Health Organization or Academy of, American Academy of Pediatrics, I couldn't find anything for after the age of 10. But, considering that, the recommendation for pregnant women is 200 to 300, I figured that for ages, 9 to 13, somewhere around 200, 250, close to that same amount for 6 to 10 is generally probably within the ballpark of the recommended amount. So this DHA, of course, as you've been learning about in our other previous episodes, our plant-based source of that is algae, and not many of us are actually eating algae in our diet. So this is where an algae oil supplement is very helpful to bring in also. So let's just talk a little bit about how this nutrition shifts when we get into puberty, ages typically, 14 to 18 or so. And I do just want to also point out that this age range, 14 to 18, has been shown to have the lowest healthy eating index score. What that means is that this age range is getting the most amount of refined grains, added sugars, sodium, saturated fat, and meat in their diet, and lower amounts of veggies, fruits, whole grains, and dairy. It's actually really interesting to look at the trend of the healthy eating index score. This is just kind of one method to kind of, measure how many healthy foods kids are eating throughout their life cycle. And interestingly enough, it's our babies ages, 6 months to 12 months who have the healthiest eating index score because they're mostly just getting whole foods from their parents who are introducing solids. And then slowly, as the kids get older, this healthy eating index score declines as they go into their teenage years. And of course, it's I think of my teenage years and how I just wanted to go to the convenience store and buy chips and cookies and, pop or soda, whatever. It's what all the kids are doing. So it's kind of become this, societal pattern for sure. And I imagine it's going to be a hard one to break, but that's kind of the trend that we're working against as parents here, right? But we're going to talk about this. We're going to talk about this at the end of today's episode, just how we can relate to this, right? But in puberty, this is when there is just even more massive growth. This is when lean body mass, skeletal muscle, and body mass in general increase more than any other time in our life cycle. So this is when we have the biggest growth spurts. And for example, females can grow 3 to 4 inches during their peak adolescent growth spurt. 3 to 4 inches, that's crazy. And they gain an average of 14 to 18 pounds as well. So, maybe you remember this in your own body, just the rapid growth that happens at this time. And for males, they on average grow 4.2 inches in this puberty phase and gain on average 20 pounds. So yes, lots of growth. And this is when, of course, our calorie needs are going to increase even more. Our nutrient needs are going to increase even more as we are kind of, shifting into our adult bodies, right? So on average, males that are moderately active need about 24 to 2,800 calories, and moderately females need, around 2,000 calories at least. And I say at least because this really does vary depending on the person's, the female's um, size and also their activity level, right? But also still, when we're talking about macronutrients, it's still recommended that lipid intake or fat intake is around 25 to 35% of overall calories. And once again, this is because that rapid growth, but also our rapid cognitive development still in this phase of life. And so, having that good source of, the calorie dense but healthy whole foods that are rich in fat are very healthy in this phase of life. Protein needs to increase. For females, they go up to 46 grams as a minimum, and protein for males on average, 52 grams. So if we look at the micronutrients, they are pretty similar, to the previous age range. Calcium, we need 1,300 milligrams. Vitamin B12, it goes up to 2.4 micrograms. Vitamin D, 600 IU, so that stays the same. Iodine stays the same as well. And then DHA or EPA. DHA is recommended 250, and then EPA also. If we're taking into account the other omega-3 fatty acids as well, it's recommended that EPA, we get 150 micrograms. Sorry, that's milligrams, not micrograms. So yes, I mean, the general message is, that we just, as the child is getting bigger, we need we need just more nutrition in general. And then, as we'll talk about maybe in next week's episode, but also in all of the other episodes in Alter Your Health podcasts, when we're talking about adult nutrition, things change and it depends on our goals, right? Of course, in this phase of childhood development, the focus is on growth and development, right? Typically, when we're talking about nutrition for adults, we're talking about either, nutrition for optimizing health or reversing disease or optimizing athletic performance and so on and so forth. So it really does kind of depend on the goals when we're talking about adult nutrition. But anyway, that's not the topic of today's podcast. I think, if we take a step back and talk about, okay, what does this look like in terms of what do I actually feed my kids? To really simplify it, if we understand what a whole food plant-based diet is, we know that it includes whole grains, it includes legumes, includes fruits and vegetables, nuts and seeds. And with whole food plant-based eating, it leaves out oils and added sugars and lots of added salt and so on and so forth. So it leaves out a lot of processed foods. And I've said this before, I've kind of alluded to this in previous podcast episodes, but it's been shown that in this phase of, pediatric growth and development, that bringing in some amount of convenient foods, some amount of more kind of more calorie dense foods, slightly processed foods, like, for example, whole grain breads and more nut butters and maybe tortillas and things like this can actually be really, really helpful in making sure that kids are meeting their calorie needs, as long as they're also getting a good amount of, whole fruits and vegetables and other whole food sources that are high in protein, like beans, or bringing in some tofu or some tempeh, for example. As long as they're still getting a good amount of these whole plant foods in, it's completely fine and acceptable, and and not going to have any detrimental effect for them to have some of these convenient kind of, minimally processed and healthy foods. Of course, we want to try to make sure that, we're not giving them foods with lots of added preservatives and artificial flavors and things like this, right? We want to make sure that it's as clean as possible. But I do think it's helpful for parents to hear this, especially if they come from a strict whole food plant-based background, to know that, that it can actually be beneficial and helpful for kids to have some amount of these processed foods in their diet. Now, of course, we don't want the whole diet to revolve around those foods, but they certainly have their place, right? And so I find it really helpful. Plant-Based Juniors is a really great resource for plant-based pediatric nutrition advice. And they actually have a very simplified way of kind of understanding how to create a balanced meal, balanced plate for your child. And they say to focus on three things. The first being starches. So some kind of ideally whole grain, or maybe a whole grain bread or whole grain pasta, something like that. Bringing in a protein-rich food. So, we think of our legumes, we think of also, this is where it could be tofu or tempeh. And then also the third, or also, nuts, nut butter. And then the third thing is obviously some either vegetables or fruit or both. And those are the three things: starches, protein, fruits, and veggies. Having those three on the plate for every meal is kind of a good way to just structure a balanced meal for a kid in this range. Another principle that they suggest focusing on is to include a mix of whole foods. So, whole plant foods, we know what those are. And also foods that are convenient and or accepted by the child. And so, what this might look like is, for example, having like a taco night for the family and having, the great whole foods of, black beans and sweet potatoes chopped up and veggies chopped up. But, we also have the tortillas and, maybe also, some store-bought guacamole or whatever the convenience food is that's both convenient for you, but also accepted by the kid. Going back into that principle of just kind of, not being so restrictive about keeping all processed foods out of the child's diet, right? And we're going to talk about additional kind of psychological benefits of that in a moment here. And then the third principle that Plant-Based Juniors talks about is allowing your kid to decide if and how much they want to eat. And that's really, honoring the child's own wisdom and the messages that their body's giving them in terms of their hunger, their satiety, listening into their own appetite cues. And so, this leads me to kind of the last thing I wanted to talk about in today's episode, which was kind of how we can support our children in learning how to self-regulate their food intake and learning how to have that own personal and kind of intuitive, for lack of a better word, relationship with food and hunger and satiety. And, how we relate to the whole kind of feeding relationship can really kind of impact our child's relationship with food. And so it's been studied. There's this very kind of fascinating research done by, scientists, Ree and all sorts of other, Ree et al., we'll just kind of lump all those scientists together. Looking at the study that they've titled "Food-Related Parenting Styles Influence How Well Children May or May Not Eat." This looks at 4 specific parenting styles, including authoritarian, permissive, and neglectful. And it looks at how these 4 different parenting styles, when related to feeding and eating, can impact the child's relationship with food. And it's been shown that ideally, the authoritative, not authoritarian, but authoritative parenting approach has actually the most positive outcomes, supporting children and having healthy relationships with eating, and less of a chance of developing kind of overeating or overindulgent kind of patterns with food or overly restrictive patterns with food. And so without, I won't go into all these in depth because I know this episode's already quite long, but just kind of highlighting that the authoritative approach of parenting offers, high level of expectation. So, the parent has expectations for, how the child is ideally going to behave for their specific age range and everything. But the parent also brings a high level of warmth, empathy, and involvement. And this is different than authoritarian, where the parent has high expectations but low level of warmth. And just to kind of paint a picture of what authoritarian parenting looks like around food is more of the kind of clean your plate approach, or, one more bite, one more bite, one more bite, clean your plate. You can't leave the dinner table until you clean your plate. And, kind of more forceful kind of eating tactics. Whereas authoritative still, provides some boundaries and a lot of structure, but a lot of warmth as well. So, for example, authoritative parenting involves the following components. An authoritative parent is actively engaged during mealtime, so lots of eye contact and conversation, clear communication regarding expectations, responds to hunger and satiety cues, creates a pleasant environment around mealtime, and models healthy eating behaviors. And so some examples, if the child is not wanting to eat their broccoli, for example, kind of authoritarian approach would be like, sorry, you can't leave the table until you eat your broccoli. Whereas authoritative would say, like, okay, you don't have to eat your broccoli if you don't want to, but this is what's on the menu for dinner. We have potatoes and black bean patties and salad and broccoli. And so if you don't want your broccoli, you can have anything else on the table, but this is what we're having for dinner. So, you can eat within kind of what we have here. And so there's some boundaries, there's structure. You give some control back to the kid to allow them to choose what they want to eat on the table, but you're not also saying like, okay, well then just go get whatever you want out of the fridge or the freezer. That would be more of a permissive or indulgent parenting style, where the parent is just catering to the kid, just wanting to make the kid happy all the time. And there's like little guidelines regarding to food intake. Permissive parenting styles might also include using food as a form of comfort or control to reward their child's behavior. They really just let the child decide when and where and what to eat. So there's really no kind of boundaries. And that kind of parenting style can usually lead to the child eating a lot of food with salt and sugar and not as many healthy foods. Whereas authoritarian, where there is some structure and some boundaries, but also a high level of warmth, tends to lead to the child developing healthier eating habits. And then, of course, there's the neglectful parenting type, which is really no structure with, prepping meals or having any meal times, no guidelines around food intake, ignores the child's hunger and satiety. It's kind of like the kid is on their own, right? And so that's also not very helpful. That generally results in the kid being unable to recognize their hunger and satiety cues and just not being so connected with that. And so, there's so much more we could talk about all these different parenting styles and everything. But, to me, it makes a whole lot of sense that it's like it's the parents' responsibility to create the structure around what the meal will be, when the meal will be presented. And it's up to the child to decide what they want to eat within that meal, right? And this goes back to, this is why kind of child-led weaning, baby-led weaning is becoming more and more of a popular thing, because once again, it's the same kind of structure where the parent is providing food for the baby, but the baby is feeding themselves. The baby is tuning into their own hunger and satiety messages and, deciding what feels good in their body, and really creating that healthy relationship with food from the moment that food is introduced in their life. And I think that that's beautiful. It's beautiful because we're really honoring the wisdom of our bodies, of not only our bodies, but our child's bodies as well. Because even though they're young, they have the same wisdom in their bodies as well as we do. And so I think really kind of, handing back a little bit of control over to them in this kind of authoritative parenting approach is really, really beautiful. Really, really beautiful. Um, Anyway, like I said, this is all lovely information. And Ben and I will get to experience this in the next 18 years as Grace is growing up. And, wish us luck. I wish you all luck as well in, just creating that kind of relaxed and healthy and happy environment around meal times. I know one thing I wanted to also talk about in this podcast that I'm kind of, running out of time, so I don't really have time to talk about is also just how we relate to foods that aren't included in the whole food plant-based diet, because I know it can also, it's been shown, it can also be detrimental to kind of be too restrictive about the foods that our children are eating. And, they can have kind of that rebound effect where, if, for example, you don't have X amount of food in your own kitchen when they go over to their friend's house and they just want to, they're obsessed with that food and they want to eat that food. And I'll just share, I'm sure there's lots of different opinions out there on this, but I'm just going to share how I see how I'm going to approach these situations. And I think that, there's definitely no benefit in being uber restrictive. I think my approach is going to be that in our household, these are the healthy foods that we like to enjoy. And, knowing that the majority of our children's diet is going to be made up of nourishing, nutritious foods, I'm going to be completely okay with my children having, the occasional treat here or there, whatever it is. But certainly don't want to create any kind of weird restrictive eating kind of pressure habits for our kids, because we know that can then, kind of snowball into other restrictive eating patterns and behaviors that, we don't want our kids to pick up on, right? So anyway, that's a big loaded topic in and of itself, but just wanted to mention that as well. And thanks for listening. There's always so much I want to put in these episodes, but I think I got the key points at least. So thanks for tuning in. I'll see you next week for another episode. And until then, enjoy your week. All right.